Welcome to Breathtakingly Imperfect, a podcast dedicated to exploring the human experience and sharing of heart-earned wisdom, all to help you live with love, presence, and freedom. I offer insights from my own journey of healing, new peace, and personal growth in hopes of inspiring you to find meaning, fulfillment, and a true love for life. I'm your host, Yesenia. Let's walk this breathtakingly and imperfectly beautiful journey I call life. I believe words, especially the way we receive them now in podcasts, are an art. It's what I chose to use and connect the subjects I feel can help us find and develop our ability to live with an unshakable sense of peace. Here, you'll find words that aim to connect deeply and are filled with freedom. I don't seek to be right or wrong, but rather give my passions and perspectives openly and genuinely to those who are ready to find themselves. The purpose of today's episode is to share my story about understanding what courage is, how I learned to strengthen it, and the way I've appreciated how it propels being on a journey of self-identity. As always, this is just my story, except for the courage that's in it. That part is universal. That's what I found was worth knowing more about, because it's what you'll be tasked to use when life brings you down a series of paths and choices. When I look back at the beginning stages of exploring who I was, all I could remember thinking about was when I'd reached that point of knowing who I was. I thought about what I discover, what it would feel like, and how I'd live from that point forward. I didn't know it back then, but in order to reach these depths of myself, I'd have to know what courage was and how to use it, as well as understand that it wasn't the same as being strong like I thought. Courage would require more from me than just being strong, and both would still transform the way I continued to grow. As a first-generation Mexican-American kid from the south side of Chicago, I'd known strength. It's what I used on the outside, and now that I think about it, it was only used purely to survive. But courage, I've learned is found and starts and is used from the inside. Courage was something I learned had to be connected to my heart to help decipher situations that needed clarity, and what I anchored in for self-trust and action that always drew me closer towards inner peace. And on a path of self-discovery, authenticity, and growth, courage will be necessary. So developing a relationship with courage now helps progress your journey later by becoming familiar with when to use it. For years, I'd mistaken strength for courage, but one was protecting while what I needed and wanted was expansion. And courage provides just that. Exploring who you are is also part of a journey of self-identity, which requires us to discover and embrace our personal beliefs, our values and experiences, and just all the things that make each of us unique. The real task there is separating from the beliefs, the values, and experiences that are woven into our own but belonged to others. This is where courage is needed. My journey of self-identity arrived at a point of exploring the parts of me I was ready to part with. These came with difficult choices that didn't always appease everyone. I was told I was wrong and I was making a mistake or that I would regret it later. And because these conversations were with people that I cared about, I felt shot between what my next steps forward would be. So the action and their input. Fear, doubt, and anxiety would always creep in these instances. Strength here would have probably been like, well, I don't care what you feel or think, I'm just going to do this anyways, and just moved on. Just pushing out the external obstacles right out of the way. It's what I would have liked to do too, but what remained, that self doubt, that was all mine. And it would be all mine. Courage, because I found it lives within, is what propels the actions I take in spite of the fears. And it does so because when you use courage, you're tapping into the endurance of your motivation or focus. You're tapping into navigating resiliently through challenges. You're tapping into an inner fortitude of trust for yourself that feels right and aligned with your virtues. So when I found myself at a crossroads, courage says there is pushback from my loved ones, and I'm still making this decision, and it scares the hell out of me. But I know why I'm doing it and where my heart's at with this. I'll overcome the obstacles because the opportunity to trust in myself is far greater than the risk. And just like with any relationship that exists in the world, it has to start somewhere and it has to be developed over time. The connection between you and courage begins the moment you say yes to trusting it. The first time that I had to use courage was a pretty intense time. It had to do with setting boundaries while shedding family tied norms. But these bigger instances aren't the only times in which you need to use courage. You can lean into it with every seemingly small aspect of the vision that you have for your life and what you're trying to achieve. Here's an example of something that can seem small but has a big impact. As I said earlier, I was a first gen Mexican American, and I also consider myself a first gen ADHD parent. Before my kids and I, ADHD was seen as just typical behavior and a way of being, meaning that it was completely unmanaged in every single possible way within our family. And truthfully, I didn't truly understand what ADHD was and the way that it could affect both kids and adults, not just from learning, but from everything to the way that they socialized and had relationships. So when my child was officially diagnosed, I did what I do best and got right to work, learning about ADHD, meeting with teachers, setting up specialist appointments, and just advocating for what I realized was something our entire household would have to make adjustments for. That's just how I do. One of the things that was most important for me was to help my child develop self-regulation in order to manage outbursts and reduce his reactivity. I'd read up on impulsivity and how giving your kids an extra 6 seconds after an outburst allows them to just catch up to their emotions. I knew how crucial it would be for them to have this skill as they navigated the world and especially in their relationships. That, though, would require me to provide co-regulation so that they had the opportunity to manage themselves. And implementing in the privacy of my home was one thing. Out in public was a whole nother. And in the early stages of this newly placed goal, we were out with family at an arcade. I honestly don't even remember what triggered an outburst from my son. But I do remember we were getting ready to enter laser tag and putting all the gear on for it, and that the room was like crowded and there's just a lot going on. Then my kid snapped. I could feel the stares of my family saying, "Are you really going to let him talk to you like that?" In their eyes, it would have been a major sign of inferiority, not to respond with the upper hand. And on top of the stares, I felt my heart pumping. I felt embarrassed. Just like my cheeks were burning up, and like I was just dumbfounded for a bit, like frozen. But here's what I did and how it truthfully felt. I looked at my son. I remembered the value in teaching and modeling calmness that I'd set out to help him develop. And it was like in that crowded room, all of a sudden, it was just me and my kid. I had courage to maintain my focus on a value that was key for my family, regardless if no one else understood. And that value is patience. Courage felt the anger and embarrassment, but withstood its difficulty and created like this bubble that pushed all of the external circumstances right outside of it and locked me in within what was truly important. That day, I gave my kid 6 of the longest seconds I've ever experienced. He literally went from 100 to 0 and apologized on his own just because of those extra 6 seconds. Finding the courage to look past what I've grown up knowing was disrespect, or putting him in his place as the adult, was only possible because I chose to do what felt right in my heart and trusted it was what I needed to do. That journey started as a grueling one and was just that for a really long time. But man, oh man, has it proven to me time and time again just how much can change in the way that your life unfolds and the way that you get to live it. I took a step outside of what no one else saw was problematic and typical behavior and worked to keep our path aligned with heart and with purpose. And now I get to see firsthand how that has given my family the opportunity to connect even more with their life. Even in those small moments, you create big opportunities for the rest of your life. So you see, courage isn't just needed during big family moments. They're also important in the small ones too. The key here is to pay attention and take notice where courage, it's making itself present for us to use. Now that we've talked about courage, we must also talk about fear, because when we use courage, it's most likely being used up against fear. Fear is what pushes us back from being able to use courage. And in being courageous, the ability to act despite what we fear is key. It's literally what defines courage. So becoming familiar with how fear relates to what we're needing courage for is sometimes exactly what is needed to strengthen it. On my journey of exploring who I am, I thought I was going to have some like big revelation. But what I end up discovering was that by removing layers and building new ways of living life, I was finding myself a little more each time. Every time I put an old way to rest or set out to create a new one, fear would creep in and really work to push up against the things I was focused on accomplishing. Becoming open to the possible reason for the fears that you're experiencing minimizes the size of the fear and maximizes courage. Sometimes realizing what the fear is doesn't necessarily mean you have to overcome it right away. You can still move forward with fear in tow. That's courage. After all, by literal definition, courage is the ability to do something that frightens you. But when you process the fears, you're put in a place that helps to determine if the fear outweighs your next actions, your next goals, your values, your changes, and whatever else you got going on. And in facing your fears, you're placing yourself in a position that actually gives face to the issues that we probably ignored or were too scared to deal with in the past, and therefore stunted our growth. When I had that situation with my son at the arcade, as successful as I felt like it had been, it sat with me for a while, and I couldn't understand why. What I learned was to explore past the emotions, past the frustration and embarrassment in my case, and get down to the nitty gritty. What was I fearing that day? I realized a couple things. For one, in my family, especially as young parents, we were accustomed to what's called fear-based parenting, which is defined as where decisions are made to appease observers rather than serve the child's needs. Recognizing fear-based parenting did a few things for me. For one, it was one of the things that internally I knew did not sit right with me anymore. It was also a type of parenting style that I was leaving behind. This was also one of the things that on the outside, people didn't agree with and pushed back against, and ultimately required courage to drive my actions forward regardless of everything. Now, fearing other parents' judgment, that one was more challenging because it wasn't some habit or belief I picked up from someone else. It was something that was important to me. I think if it would have been a habit that I picked up somewhere else, it would have been easier to separate from it. The importance I found in the approval of being seen as an exceptional parent was born right from within me. For me, one situation brought out two types of fears with one solution to both. Courage. One required me to part with habits. The other helps us understand ourselves a little bit deeper and helps us recognize the qualities that we already have. And look, I'm pretty proud of the way that I handled myself that day at the arcade. That day, I'd had more courage than fear with the situation. But by becoming aware of what I was fearing, I was preparing myself to continue to take steps in the direction that I wanted for my family. In the time that followed, situations came up relating to this fear of fear-based parenting. And when they did, I'd lock in. Remember, my kids' needs were more important to me than appeasing others. And when I wrestled with feelings of fear about other parents' judgment, I centered in on the values I already had as a parent. Those I was working towards accomplishing. And over time, the intensity that fear had slowly diminished. Exploring my fears and creating action centered in heart and with courage not only drew me closer to who I am, it also gave me a tool and skill that helps create a life that feels more mine than it ever has before. Now, I know who I am as a parent. And with growing kids, even that continues to change, but on my terms, not anyone else's. And just like I held on to the importance that my son's success in life meant to me as I dealt with my fears, you too can determine the value in the actions that you want to take. remembering that overcoming everything else clears the way. Your moment may not look like this, but one thing is for sure, we all have them. We look for some big life-changing moment, and then something seemingly less important happens, like a kid throwing a fit in the arcade. The point is, that one moment was still a building moment in a series of moments that created a different reality for my family and for me as a person. So when you're in that moment, when you're pulled between an action to react or prove something to someone else, it's important you stay anchored in the something that is deeper within you, asking you to choose differently. That is courage. In the space between fear and courage is vulnerability. Apparently, like many others in the world, when I thought of what it meant to be vulnerable, I thought it just meant being exposed. I truthfully didn't know what this even truly meant until maybe 3 years ago. It's just one of those things you can add to the list of things we weren't raised to learn about, me or my husband. That is until it's developed. Brené Brown writes, "There is no courage without vulnerability." Courage requires the willingness to lean into uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Okay, so there's some exposure, but just stay with me here. Vulnerability creates momentum when making your way from a place of fear to courage, because it requires our truth, the truth. And like I said, I did not know a thing about vulnerability. I'll explain as best as I can what I felt exposure meant and to be exposed in the world. In metaphorical terms, I was taught to shield my garden from the world, because if I did, then and only then would it be protected. My job was to keep the natural flow of earth out, right? So like not too much sun, not too much wind, rain, or snow. No one was allowed to stay inside for too long. And if they were, it was probably because they wanted to judge my progress or stifle my growth or take what I've grown. And on the days I would allow visitors to stroll my garden, I was to keep my favorite things out of sight and only show what appeared normal and orderly, kind of like a showcase, not a true representation of my garden. Fear of what could happen did 3 things. First, it kept me in my bubble. Second, it prevented my growth. And 3, it kept everyone from who I truly was. At least for me, courage meant opening my garden exactly as it was. Vulnerability in that context meant taking down the shield that was meant to protect from the weather and realize my garden would go through different seasons. It would mean embracing and not hiding from what my life is presented with each day. It meant inviting people in my garden without fear. It meant I would show them what I'd grown, what I was working on, and what didn't work out. At the end of the day, it's a garden in progress. It meant my garden was mine. They had theirs. And this was just what my garden was in this moment. It's realizing vulnerability means your garden never needed approval. It needed you to be honest about the way it existed. Courage and vulnerability helps us live in our life more honestly while inviting others to our growth. When I think about my shielded garden, what I thought was protection was done out of what Brené Brown describes as perfectionism, pleasing, and proving to protect our egos and feelings. Taking down my shield is having worked through the realization that I'm at peace with who I am or how my garden is. And that, like the weather, which we can't control, sometimes it takes a toll on my garden. But what's there is mine authentically. In Atlas of the Heart, she goes on to say that vulnerability is not oversharing, it's sharing with people who have earned the right to hear our stories and our experiences. So when I say inviting others to our garden, does not mean every single person, even though every single person does deserve to see exactly who we are. When I kept up appearances in my garden, I did it because I didn't trust anybody, not even the people I claimed to love the most. I had to learn to trust that my fear, which was I'm not good enough, would work with my vulnerability, which was I'm afraid you won't think I'm good enough. That opened courage and said, hey, this is me. The power and courage is owning our vulnerabilities while braving fear. One of the ways to start is by asking who has earned the right to hear my story and be part of my experience, whatever that may be. It's a trust that, yeah, is exposing, but only of who you really are. When you think about it, living otherwise is a disguise that we've mistaken for protection. Vulnerability fades away. Perfectionism strengthens what makes us human. It creates the path that allows us to live courageously. Distinguishing strength from courage means understanding the way one has the potential to protect, but does not provide growth, while the other works through our fears as we move forward. Courage can be used to better understand our inherited ways, expectations, and norms that no longer align with ourselves. Understanding what courage really means is understanding yourself better by understanding the emotions that come up. It's knowing that courage entails we keep going forward in spite of the fears on our path. Vulnerability bridges the gap between fear and courage. It does so by requiring honesty only within ourselves. With courage on the journey of finding yourself, you're able to continue to evolve within a life that feels genuinely your own. Over time, courage then truly becomes strong enough. You're finally able to define who you are and on your own terms. The journey of understanding who I am is one that would not have been possible without being completely honest with myself. And I get it. That is something incredibly difficult to do. For me, it felt like my life hadn't been my own and everything around me was someone else's. But that's the thing about realizations. They're different for all of us, and they're all made up of different parts of us, all with the potential for transformation. Courage was a tool that helped me through the difficulties and fears of accepting my reality and created accountability within myself for the things I was setting out to do. Courage, to me, is the inner shell made up of different layers of fears that I was challenged by. The essence of courage, though, is in its outer shell. It's because of that outer part that can be planted that those inner layers are able to transform. But like with any seed, it needs to be watered for its possibilities to flourish. Courage allows us to begin the planting process, taking the seed from sitting dormant to working through its growth. Courage brought me closer to the life I was working to create, while vulnerability helped me know and be more sure of who I was and who I am. Courage, like vulnerability, stem from a trust to live our hearts out fearlessly. I like to view life as our very own gardens, meant to be nurtured, cleared, and just allowed to bloom. So as you go on to explore your life's personal oasis, as always, may you leave here only with what can help yours grow. I am so grateful to have shared the space with you. And if this episode planted something within you, you can water it with me on Instagram, where this community continues to bloom. The link for that is in the show notes. Until next time, keep honoring your growth, trusting your path, and embracing this breathtakingly and perfectly beautiful journey